Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Every Move Explained. Before I begin, I'd like to invite viewers and subscribers to please leave comments or requests on what material you would like to see in the future. And let us begin this Every Move Explained series, episode 6. And today we have two chess legends, Jose Capablanca versus Alexander Alekhine, played in 1914 in St. Petersburg. And both of these players are former world chess champions. This game was played earlier in their careers. In 1914, Capablanca went on to become world champion in 1921, and Alexander Alekhine became world champion by defeating Capablanca in 1927. And so this is a very interesting game where it is early in Alekhine's career and he's playing with black against Capablanca with the white pieces. Let's begin. So Capablanca begins with d4, a more strategic opening and positional, as d4 openings tend to not exchange as much in the center as e4 openings, which are usually more tactical. So this d4 move controls the center, attacking c5 and e5, and allows the bishop room to develop. And so Alekhine responds with d5, also taking control of the e4 central square and allowing room for his bishop to develop. And so here we have the Queen's Gambit, where c4 is moved, this pawn is moved to c4, where it is gambited, which means it can be captured, although black does not have to capture this pawn. And the pawn, if it is captured, white could move to e3 or e4 and later try to recapture this pawn with the bishop, or a queen check on a4 and then recapturing of this pawn. And so this c4 move attacks the d5 pawn, trying to capture a more valuable central pawn with a side pawn. And that would be a favorable exchange for white. And black responds with c6 to protect the d5 pawn, possibly block checks by the queen to a4. And also, if white now captures a central pawn with one of the side pawns, then black would just recapture, placing his side pawn back into the center here. And so e3. So this just bolsters the d4 pawn. It allows room for the queen and the bishop to develop. And then knight to f6. So this develops the knight off the back rank, and it helps control the center, especially the d5 pawn here, which is starting to be put under pressure by white attacking here with c4, and white could potentially move up with his knight to c3 to put more pressure on this pawn. And so white develops his knight, taking control of the center, attacking d4 and protecting this d4 pawn, and also attacking e5 to make it harder for black to push a pawn here to e5 in the future. And so now we have e6, and this helps bolster the d5 pawn, and it also allows this bishop to develop off the back rank. And here knight to d2 is played, and this move, instead of moving to c3, this knight move attacks the e4 square, so it could deter this knight from jumping into this e4 square, and it also bolsters this knight on f3. So if the knight on f3 decides in the future to move up to this outpost square here on e5, then this knight could jump in behind and fortify this knight when it moves up to e5 here. And so black does the same, bringing this knight up here to d7, where it can help control this e5 square. So if white decides to move here, black could exchange off pieces. And also, if this knight of black's moves to e5, it could jump in here behind it to f6 to reinforce that. Okay, so here we have bishop to d3. So this helps fight for this e4 square, deterring this knight from jumping in here, as now we could just have a knight capture, and then if the bishop, or excuse me, if the pawn recaptures, the bishop would just capture a free pawn. And so also this bishop move allows white to castle kingside. And bishop to e7, allowing the king to castle and just getting this bishop off the back rank. The bishop could have moved to d6 as well, but here is also a decent square in this opening for this bishop to move to, where it controls these diagonals. And castling by white. So the king is taken into safety behind this wall of pawns and this protective knight. It's removed from the center, where if a king is left too long in the center, it can be attacked from 3 different directions. Straight on, down the middle, and then from the right or the left. But once you castle, the king can only be attacked from 2 different directions. Straight ahead, or from the left here if it castles kingside, because nothing can come from off the side of the board here, of course. So the king is just safer. There are less avenues of attack on your king once you castled. So it is always good to castle early and castle often in your games. And also this rook is brought closer to the center, where it may move to e1, or it could remain on f1 and fortify a pawn push with this f-pawn moving forward. And now black does the same, castling the king to safety, moving the rook closer to the center. And now we have queen to c2. And so this is often a good square for the queen in this position, where it bolsters this bishop and forms a battery here aiming at h7 toward the king side. But the queen also eyes this c-file up into black's position, and especially if there are, well, if black's queen moves to c7 and is unprotected in their exchanges, the black queen will have to watch for a capture if that queen is not protected. And so here we have a capture in the center by black, well, from the center to the side pawn. So this move, it relieves the tension here that was building, but it kind of gives up the center to black, so, or excuse me, to white. Black is kind of cramped in this position. We see now that the central pawns, white has 2 central pawns and black only has 1 now. And white has more space in the center with his d4 pawn, as opposed to black's e6 pawn. So this exchange it probably favors white some, and it opens this file for white. So there's a half open file that white may make use of. And so here we have a capture. Another problem with that pawn capture by black, now it allows this knight to jump up here to c4 to recapture, but from here this knight can further jump up into e5 and cause problems here for black's position. And so now finally, because black has given up the center a little bit by taking his d-pawn and capturing white's c-pawn, now black fights back in the center with his c-pawn against white's d4 pawn. And ignoring this attack here, the knight repositions into an even better spot up here on e5, where it eyes the f7 pawn, black's king side, and it is just better positioned here on the other side of the board. And a capture in the center, so this side pawn captures white's more valuable central pawn, and then we have the e-pawn recapturing up towards the fourth rank here, giving white a little bit more space, ensuring that he has more space due to this advanced pawn compared to black's pawn on e6 here. And also we have what is called an isolated queen pawn position. So in this position, this pawn could become a weakness if many pieces are exchanged off and white does not have enough pieces to protect this pawn. So in an isolated queen pawn position, it is usually good for black to stop this pawn's forward momentum to try and prevent it from moving up here to d5 and exchanging off, because this pawn could become a weakness, but in the position now it gives white more space, so at this time it's probably an advantage. So black will try to position his pieces to blockade this pawn, so possibly placing a knight here, moving this knight either to b6 to reinforce a knight that can be placed on d5, but also using his knights to prevent any forward momentum of this pawn. And at the same time, black will attempt to trade pieces off to eliminate the defenders of this isolated pawn. And if the more pieces that are exchanged off, the harder it will be for white to defend this pawn. And so here we have this knight move where both of these knights on b6 and f6 attempt to just stop this pawn in its tracks. And here we have an interesting move, knight to g5. So this knight launches forward here, attacking this h7 square, and there's a threat here of the bishop capturing here, and of course if the knight would recapture, then we would have a mate with the queen. And so white, I'm sure that Capablanca would anticipate that Alekhine would see this small attack here and defend, but when Alekhine defends by moving to g6, it creates weaknesses around the black king on these dark squares. So now h6 and f6 become weak because this g pawn is pushed forward and is no longer able to cover these h6 and f6 squares. And so the knight just moves back. He has already achieved the weakening of the king side, and now this knight would just be in the way here white would like to place his bishop up here and attack these weak squares, attack the rook. And the king moves forward to prevent the bishop from jumping into this h6 square here. And the bishop must be developed anyway, so it moves to g5 here, where it would like to place some pressure on this knight on f6, and if the knight moves, white can exchange his bad dark squared bishop, which would be blocked by the same colored pawn in the center, with black's good bishop here, which occupies the opposite colored squares of his central pawn. And so the knight repositions here into the center to blockade this pawn, and it jumps into this outpost that cannot be attacked here because white has no pawns on the c or e files. And in response, white moves his rook to c1, trying to take control with the queen of the c file. And so here we have the bishop developing, and this is a bad bishop, so black is not worried if this bishop is captured, which white will not do because this is a well-placed, strong knight here, and he does not want to give it up for this blocked-in bishop. And also, by moving this bishop, black can place a rook here and contest this c file, which white is controlling at the moment. And so, anticipating the rook attack here, the queen moves out of the way, bolsters this bishop, creating a battery and threatening to move the bishop to h6 here, attacking the king. And once the king would move, this bishop on h6 would be able to capture the rook. And so, anticipating that move, we have a knight retreat back to g8 to cover this square here on h6 to prevent that bishop from attacking the king and the rook. And here we have a capture, trading the bishops off. And so white gets rid of his bad bishop for for black's good bishop, but also by removing that bishop, the dark squared bishop of black's, it can no longer jump in here and help protect these weak squares, which are created by this g6 pawn push here. And so the queen recaptures, and then we have bishop to e4, threatening to capture this knight on d5. And now we have an attack by this bishop to b5, attacking the f1 rook. And so the rook moves here to an open file. And we see one advantage, of this isolated d pawn is both files on either side of this isolated pawn are open completely here on the c file and half open here on the e file. And so these are good posts for the rooks to barrel up the e file and c file and try and exert pressure against black's position. And so we have a queen moving here to d6 and trying to get closer to the action in the center and help contest this d5 square here. And so a capture, the pawn recaptures, and now both sides have isolated queen pawns. But by black capturing with the pawn here, with this pawn capture, they have equal space in the center, and there's something I wanted to go over back here, a couple moves back. Let's see. Excuse me. I'm going to go back here to this bishop to e4 move, and then after this, black went bishop to b5. And so if instead he had moved this knight up here to f6, there is a possibility of the bishop capturing, then knight captures, and then knight to g4. And then here, f6 to prevent this f knight from moving forward. And then h6 would be possible. And the king would have to move to h8. So black did not want to get caught in a position like this. And so that's why instead of playing the knight at g to f6, he played this bishop to b5 move. And so if we go back to that, excuse me, I wanted to take a look at that line, which I'd put that variation in here to highlight it. So instead, bishop to b5 was played in the game. And then we had rook, which was being attacked, moved to e1. And then the queen comes into the center to help fight here on the d5 square. Capture by the bishop and recapture by the pawn. And then we have queen to a5 attacking this bishop on b5. And then a6 protecting the bishop with the pawn. Queen to c7. So here Capablanca moves his queen up to c7, attacking black's queen, knowing that if exchanges occur, it will pull his rook up to the 7th rank where it will be more powerful. And so we have an exchange, and this rook makes it to the 7th rank. And anytime you can place your rooks on the 7th rank, it is almost always an advantage, because many times your opponent's pawns, they begin here on this 7th rank or your opponent's 2nd rank, and especially if you can get 2 rooks lined up on this 7th rank, they can do a lot of damage attacking these pawns, and the king as well if it's moved forward like this. And so the rook grabs this fine spot here on c7, and this move h6 is played to help keep the knight out of g5, because here we could have a threat of the knight jumping to g5, attacking on f7, but also threatening from g5 to jump here into e6, and this pawn would be pinned to the king, and a knight here on e6 would fork the king and the rook. And so here's an example of what that would look like. So if instead of h6, if the pawn was protected, and then we have that knight moving up here, attacking this f7 pawn, but also threatening this fork on e6 of the king and the bishop. So black decides to give up this pawn, this b pawn, and let me go back here. And so Alekhine plays h6 to keep this knight on f3 out of g5. And Capablanca captures this material, so goes ahead a pawn in this game. And because the rook moved off of the c7 square, Capablanca gives up this c-file, and so Alekhine tries to take control of it. And here we have this pawn push. So this is an anticipation of this rook moving down to c2 here and attacking these pawns. So now with this pushed forward, the a pawn can push up to a4, attacking the bishop, and when the bishop moves, this b7 rook will protect the pawn here on b3. Okay, and so the rook moves down to c2, taking control or trying to fight for control of this second rank of whites. And the pawn was also under attack, so it moves forward, attacking the bishop, and the bishop must move. So this bishop comes down here, attacking the knight, and Capablanca avoids the trade, moves his knight up here to h4, and now we have both these knights attacking this pawn on g6, and this protector of the pawn, the base of this small pawn chain, is pinned here by the rook on b7. So here Alekhine is in trouble. And back during this period, Capablanca was known as a chess machine, a nickname that he had for just rarely losing, winning most of his games, and any games that were close would be draws, and he would rarely lose back in this time period. And of course, he went on to become world champion in, let's see, this was 1914, so 7 years later he became world champion. Alright, so here h5 is played, potentially limiting any move back here to g4 by this knight, and also giving the king some space to maneuver, because I don't know, there's just a lot of pressure building up on Alekhine here by Capablanca. And so here we have a capture of the g6 pawn, which is not protected because this pin here by the rook. So the rook moves here to relieve some of the pressure and exchange possibly, but already, and also, excuse me, the rook was under attack here on f8 by this knight, so it had to move. And now in this position, we should have had a resignation already by Alekhine, but he plays on a little further, probably because he's playing such a great player and wanted to learn from him, and just decided to, maybe go for a possible stalemate. Okay, so I went back a little bit to this when the bishop was attacking the knight here on f3, and it moved to h4, and here we had h5. But I wanted to show you what would have happened if the knight was attacked here by g5. So this is kind of interesting. If this knight would have been attacked here by the pawn, we have check here on f5. So the king would have to move. And it's already, I don't know, pretty bad here for Alekhine. But then we could have had this, knight to g3. And now this bishop is under attack, and the bishop cannot go anywhere. The knight covers this square, this knight covers h5, and the knight covers d3. So anyway, this bishop would just be trapped. And so that is the reason that g5 could not have been played earlier to chase the knight away. So if we go back, after this move here, so the knight cannot be chased away with g5 because the bishop would end up being trapped, and so that's why this h5 move was played. But then the knights start jumping in here, capturing, and the rook was under attack. It moves. And so now we have a check. And the king must move. And now white presses forward with this f4 pawn push, further limiting the possibility of escape for this king. So now the king is under horrible pressure here. And so Alekhine, running out of moves, just pushes a pawn forward, trying to prevent any forward movement by these pawns on the queen side. And now this knight to h4. So there's a threat here of knight to f5, checkmate. So black must do something immediately. And so he captures off, exchanging this knight for the rook, recapture. And now, if knight to f5, there would be an escape here for the king. Alright, so the king moves forward, and Alekhine should probably have resigned already, but he plays on further. He presses forward, attacking the knight. So g3 just protects that knight. The king pushes forward. He can't move any of his pawns, and just his king and knight and these pieces. So perhaps he is thinking maybe he can get some kind of stalemate out of this if he exchanges off his pieces. Or maybe he just wanted to see what Capablanca would do to end the game. And so, check by the rook. The king slides into this h3 hole. And here, Alekhine finally resigned as the knight jumps to g2 with the threat of knight to f4, which would be a checkmate. And so here, there's no way to stop that knight to f4 checkmate move. And Alekhine finally resigned, although Capablanca just slowly put the pressure on Alekhine, and Alekhine should have resigned earlier. But here we see an example of these two chess legends earlier in their career, but at this point, Capablanca had more experience than Alekhine and just slowly squeezed his position until the king was just running for its life. And I hope you enjoyed this game of two chess legends, Jose Capablanca and Alexander Alekhine, two former world chess champions. And this was played in St. Petersburg, 1914. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions, especially any comments on what type of chess material you would like to see in the future. Thank you, and have a great day.